Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Intelligent Community, the podcast of the Intelligent Community Forum. I'm Lou Zaccarella, one of the founders of ICF. Today, we continue our series, Policing the Intelligent Community, with a very special guest. This series is brought to you by our ICF affiliate organizations in Canada and Taiwan. Last time, we spoke with Sergeant Pete Weisner of the Hamilton, Ontario Police Department, who took us through his street smart approach to understanding and managing what he called the marginalized triangle of addiction, mental health, and homelessness, and his approach and his city's approach to it. Now, Sergeant Pete is a product, a very unique one, of the Canadian approach to policing. Today, we're going to bring it back home, or at least home where we are, and we're going to take a look at the issue of policing in large American cities through the eyes of one of America's premier journalists. And I'm sure we're going to get a different take on policing. James Queally is an award-winning crime reporter for the Los Angeles Times and the author of the acclaimed novel Line of Sight, which in part is about a cop who uses questionable use of force. His words, he is a journalist, author, and general arbiter of fact from bullshit. I'm sorry, that's horseshit. He spent the past decade writing about crime, policing, and chaos, first in Newark, New Jersey for the Star-Ledger, and as I said, currently for the LA Times. James has covered hurricanes, hate crimes, street racing, way too many murders, protests in Ferguson, Missouri, which sparked a national movement, and tragic killings on street corners in Jersey that we've never heard of and probably never will. He says his experience has been exhilarating, and we'll try to find out why that is. But first of all, we're exhilarated to have him. James, welcome to the Intelligent Community.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, you've done a lot of crime reporting in Newark and LA, as I said, and of course, wrote about a cop who uses questionable use of force in line of sight. What aspect of policing in cities or policing overall draws you in the most? What kind of exhilarates you to do your work?
I think it's the idea that you're kind of telling, for the most part, you end up telling a person's most important story. Maybe not the most important story you're going to write, but a lot of times when you're covering either a homicide and you're covering a use of force, it's not. I guess I use the word exhilarating, and that almost that's kind of like that journalistic arrogance of bringing it back on yourself, right? It's exciting for you to be involved in the moment and the zeitgeist, but you've also got to be cognizant of the fact that, especially, when I think back on Newark, how many times I knocked on somebody's door and their loved one had either just been arrested and was now facing, potentially a life sentence for a violent crime, or conversely had been the victim of violent crime and their life had just been turned upside down. I think what draws me in is just that these moments are potentially otherwise lost to time. They could be reduced to if they're not reported out well, if they're not reported out in good detail, they could be reduced to a 4 or 5 paragraph, brief that gets shoved in the corner at the back. I guess 10 years ago, right, would be the Law and Order brief, the little column on the side of
Right.
page 5 of the Jersey section of the Star-Ledger. Now it's just a little blurb on the corner of the LA Times website. If they're not focused on, this moment changes however many lives forever, and nobody really knows about it. Like it doesn't stop the city, it maybe doesn't even stop the neighborhood unless someone comes in and finds out who that person was, what their life was, outside of the 2 or 3 last harrowing minutes. Or conversely, like you said, the other end of that being when it comes from the police side, getting the story beyond the YouTube clip or the cell phone snippet, like adding all the pieces together. I just think that's always what's pulled me in.
Right. So it sounds like you have to tell that story because there's a part of you that says these lives should not be forgotten, and this community of whom they were members should not forget them so dismissively or so readily. Something like that?
Yeah.
Is that about right? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you were recently arrested in LA during a protest, I read. What happened there? They usually don't arrest journalists, do they?
Yeah, they don't. There's LAPD has a bit of a problematic history when it comes to crowd control and protest situations that we could get into, but this goes back to 2000. They had gotten sued pretty badly over their handling of the Democratic National Convention. But more recently, I've covered protests and unrest a lot since I've come to the Times. So I tend to, even though now I cover the DA's office and courts, I still, when there's, kind of street unrest, I'm usually one of the first people up. So there was a situation in Echo Park, which is kind of a interesting neighborhood in LA that is part gentrifying but still has a large homeless presence. We have unfortunately, the city, we have a very large homeless population in general, and it's only grown in the past couple of years. Yeah. There was an encampment in Echo Park Lake itself, which is kind of a little bit of a tourist spot. It's a very popular neighborhood destination that people, you'll see a lot of photos of people using paddle boats in the lake. But there was an encampment of at least 150 homeless people. It kind of formed a community there since about late 2019. They developed a kitchen. There was kind of like almost like a little mini, I don't want to say hierarchy, but like someone kind of ran the camp. This was, as opposed to the normal like people moving around under freeways or being on Skid Row, the people that were staying there mostly felt safe. They had friends, they had family, they had kind of some semblance of a social life and a safety in being outdoors that you don't normally have being homeless in Los Angeles. The city had decided that the encampment had been there long enough, though. They were not going to let the park continue to be, kind of co-opted this way. So there was, between the combination of the LAPD and the city council, a specific city council member, I should say, moved to have it cleared. A lot of activists, a lot of people in the neighborhood were not happy about this. So they were protesting it. I was out there for 2 nights. On the second night, I kind of got stuck in, the LAPD does this thing, a lot of police departments probably, I don't know if you've ever heard the term kettling before, but at a protest, if a group they've declared an unlawful assembly, group is not retreating, not dispersing, not obeying the order to pretty much, go home or get out of this area, you're going to be arrested. They put another line of officers behind this group, and I kind of got stuck in there with a significant number of other reporters. I've been in that situation before. Normally you can flash your credential and a supervisor will, make the conscious decision of, I don't want to be the one who arrests a Los Angeles Times reporter and deals with the fallout of this. So they usually let you out. And that's happened. That's played out at least 2 times in my career before. That was not the case this time. In fairness to them, this was not, this situation was a little more tense than the other ones I've been in. There had been near physical clashes with this group a few times. I'm not placing blame on one end or the other, but it was not a situation where I could really walk up and flash the credentials. So they kind of came up, grabbed me, walked me off. And I let that happen. I get that it's you're not going to be able to talk your way out of it immediately. But as I get let off to the side, I'm trying to explain, hey, I'm pressed, credentials around my neck. This probably isn't a good idea, guys. And to the arresting officer's credit, he looked at it and kind of made the Scooby-Doo ruh-roh face and went and got his supervisor, who was less understanding, let's say.
Right.
I'm not going to get into what was said there because I've already gotten yelled at for talking about it on Twitter once. Okay. We didn't really get along so well, and then I got let off. I was about to get put on a transport bus when somebody from the media relations division got sent over. Apparently, and ironically, I had written a story the week before about the LAPD mistreating and targeting another reporter for prosecution. He happened to be standing next to me in the crowd, so he had filmed my arrest, and through the magic of social media, it had gone I guess viral, at least on an LA standpoint, and a lot of noise had been made, and I was let go. I would come to find out later, a TV reporter was also detained, but she was released, and a couple of other freelancers that had been in this immediate area were picked up and unfortunately were not released. I don't know if they're actually going to be prosecuted for failing to disperse. It's a pretty minor charge. No one's going to go to jail for this or anything. People could be fined. It still shouldn't be happening. But some of that's still in play. But as far as me, my arrest was torn up, and to the best of my knowledge, there's no record of it other than Twitter, which I guess is all of our permanent record these days.
Absolutely, yeah. No, well, that's good. Before I ask you, I want to get into sort of the issue of police reform and how it can impact our communities, because we're talking about intelligent cities. But you're from Brooklyn. Your dad was a cop. When you got in a situation like this, and you're writing about this subject, and you're writing about it both fictionally and obviously reporting on it, how much influence does that relationship have with regard to your understanding what's going on in the policeman's frame of reference? Does it help at all?
We have now reached the therapy session portion of this podcast. No, my dad and I have some interesting conversations about criminal justice, and they're not all conducted at a reasonable decibel level, and I think he'd
I
agree with
got you.
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, listen, if I didn't like to argue, I wouldn't write about controversial things.
Well, right.
So his knowing him has definitely impacted my worldview, less so as I got older. And when I write about, for like when I got arrested, we talked the next day, and he kind of understood that, yeah, that probably shouldn't have happened. He agreed with me. There've definitely been other times I've written stories critical of police or analyzing a use of force situation where he's just kind of been a little annoyed at it, quite frankly.
Right.
He's, good dude with a big heart, but
Right.
if you grew up as an NYPD officer in the 80s and 90s, he worked the Crown Heights riots,
Remember those?
first wave of Sharpton, and really, heavy criticism of the NYPD, probably on the back end of Giuliani, right? He really was, I think personally, kind of his worldview was somewhat hardened, and kind of, how there is, I don't think it's unfair to say police tend to circle the wagons when they get criticized a lot, and so do most industries. I'm not going to say reporters don't do that either.
Most
I think
families, most human
families,
beings.
yeah. So he definitely is kind of like, often when hit with criticism or ideas of police reform, he gets a little boxing stance.
Right.
Going on.
Right.
I'm using my hands like people can see me. I'm Italian for anyone listening, in case you're shocked by that.
I didn't realize that with a Y at the end. All right.
With the this, but so I think I kind of wandered away from your question. But is it how does that influence my reporting, or?
Well, it was that. I mean, you tend to, well, you're a reporter and a very good one, so you're sympathetic to the facts, right? But you seem to also have a sensitivity to the people who were arresting you, and I was just curious about that. And by the way, someday you're going to grow up to be your father. We all do. But I'll let you off the couch now. But I do want to get into police reform, because the words police reform are evidently triggering. They're being interpreted based on race, culture, political affiliation, and a range of issues that probably weren't the ones that they were talking about back in the 80s and 90s in the city. As a matter of fact, I know they weren't. But what, in your view, does it actually mean with regard to your observation and to making cities safer and enabling communities to go forward in a positive way?
If I had to define police reform at least in the context of Los Angeles and Newark, it's historically been, it's better accountability for internal affairs investigations, for instance, right? One of the statistics that has always stuck with me as just kind of jaw-dropping with how, I've written a lot about internal affairs data and racial profiling data, and the rarity with which those complaints are upheld is kind of stunning. There's not a magic number that should be met, but Newark, for instance, and I referenced this data point early in the novel as well, they were eventually taken over or subject to a pattern or practice investigation, which is when the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division kind of starts to monitor the activities of and more or less oversee a police department. One of the main reasons they did this is because it was revealed that Newark had received, I believe in a 2-year span, 261 serious, what they term serious internal affairs complaints. That would be false arrest, excessive force, theft of property during the course of arrests, a few other categories, but those are the general. One was upheld out of 261. And this is a department that you would later find out police officers had taken a suspect into a broom closet in the department's downtown headquarters and beat them to the point that their orbital bone broke. Situations like that were not uncommon. More recently, I did a project in California looking at 10 years worth of citizen misconduct complaints filed against peace officers. I think we found something like less than 8% of 200,000 complaints across the state were sustained. It's just very rare that people can make an allegation of wrongdoing against the police officer and find that it is upheld. Beyond that, I think a lot of it has to do with correcting racial inequities, be that from a arrest standpoint, from a patrol standpoint. We've done reporting around the number of vehicle stops that happen in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods in LA versus others, and the data is just over tilted in one direction. Some of it's also just rebuilding community trust. I mean, you see it now when you're at protest scenes. You've got people even people that did not grow up in marginalized communities that maybe have not actually been on the wrong end of some of these situations I'm describing, that just do not have any faith in law enforcement whatsoever. You've seen
Right.
this give rise to, something of the abolition movement that is kind of the undercurrent of the defund movement right now. So I think it can mean a lot of things depending on your experience, but generally, if I was trying to boil it down into something, I would say it's just generally a push or a call for more fairness and for more equity in public safety.
Yeah. You mentioned trust, James, which, Malcolm Gladwell just wrote a terrific book about that issue. And he spends, I think, the last part of it talking about policing. So it has even worked its way into that sort of social science. But do the problems of drugs, homelessness, and crime, I mean, is there a common intersection in LA that sort of could be universally addressed or looked at with regard to sort of repairing these things to the extent they can be repaired, and then maybe generating trust? And I guess I'm asking, how does trust get restored?
There's an arguable nexus to some of that, especially with low level crime. I mean, you're seeing an attempt to combat this issue now a little bit more from the LA County District Attorney's Office than you are from local law enforcement. There was a new DA elected last November,
Right.
the former DA in San Francisco, George Gascon. He's considered, and I don't know how much you've gone into the progressive prosecutor movement in previous episodes, but he's one of the bigger names in that movement that you've seen also change the things not necessarily change things, but change at least the office's practices compared to the more traditional approach to prosecution in Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, a couple other major American cities. He is generally a big champion of diversion programs. So when you mentioned a homeless person or a mentally ill person gets arrested, if they get arrested for a nonviolent crime, they try to nudge that person towards services prior to filing, or possibly towards a treatment program, toward housing. They pretty much try to. The general idea is to avoid criminalizing homelessness. So there's a list of crimes, misdemeanors. The DA's office specifically won't charge now, and a lot of it has to do with public intoxication or public indecency, as far as frankly, public urination. I mean, you go to some parts of LA and you've got encampments that are 50 tents deep, and there's not a porta potty in sight. So people can eventually get cited for doing what the body is telling them to do. And I'm not advocating for people to be urinating in the streets, but I'm also saying maybe don't throw them in a jail cell. So there is a nexus to that. There's certainly a nexus to addiction and crime, obviously. Some of the LAPD does have programs that also do target this, and you're immediately any advocate, especially for the unhoused, that is going to hear this back in LA is going to immediately start screaming at me that they're part of the problem. That's kind of the issue here. The LAPD does have these things like Reset and Hope. They're acronyms that I can't remember what exactly they mean, but they're supposed to kind of go out there and interact with homeless people, and it's supposed to be a non or less kind of militarized approach. It's intended to be more of a kind of hand than a stick, but it doesn't always work out that way. And you will
Right.
And again, there's the same communal trust issues extend to the unhoused. They're used to seeing the police moving them off a corner or ordering them to go somewhere else, or defending, or rather working more security for when like Department of Water and Power or another city entity comes to clean up an area around an encampment, and they just kind of see them as an invading force, fair or unfair to the LAPD.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of creates those same problems.
Right. Yeah, and of course, someone in my position with my kind of life would say, well, gee, there's no civic connection, right? That, and it sounds almost Pollyannish, but when we talk about the word trust, one of the things that we look at the ICF is there a way to keep people home? Because a lot of things that we see in communities that are in the sort of this post-industrial hangover phase are the talented people are leaving. There's nothing there in those communities. I grew up in a place like that in upstate New York. It's why I moved to New York City. And so, the fabric begins to erode. And the things that built trust in neighborhoods, maybe like the one you grew up in, begins to just not exist anymore. You're fundamentally living with strangers, your economy's sunk, and you have all of these things enter in. Is that a fair analysis of why it's difficult to establish trust? And to go back to the ICF proposition, if we could keep people home and keep them there for generations, will the human effect of watching over one another kick in again? And again, that's an opinion. I don't know if you've got any facts around that.
I mean, I would just be speculating, but I mean, the arena is, at least just in LA, where the police department and more so the sheriff's department really struggles with community trust, are not the transplant neighborhoods. They're not the parts of LA that you see, frankly, me and 100,000 other New Yorkers descending on, or Chicago. The PD generally, it's still suffers. It's the most criticism it takes for use of force cases and for over arrest or for over policing are in South LA, South Central, are in predominantly Black communities that are, generally the people living there are second and third generation. The sheriff's department largely takes criticism for its handling of Compton, of situations in East Los Angeles, which is predominantly Latino. And those also are not, they're not new people in LA. So I don't know if that really plays a role here. It does to some extent, I think, at least with some of the activist community that clashes with LAPD. You'll see, kind of going back to the situation you talked about in Echo Park, where I was arrested, a decent amount, not all, but a decent amount of the demonstrators that are challenging LAPD do seem to come more from the communities that are gentrifying those neighborhoods, and those people do tend to not always be from Los Angeles. So there is a little bit of a, maybe there's people just new to the city, don't know the history, and
Right.
are not, really, and that doesn't take away their right to be part of the demonstration, but there's no inborn goodwill, or they might have not have had a historic positive interaction with the department or some other,
Right.
situation. But generally, at least with the agencies that I deal with, the trust issues kind of go back. They go back to Rodney King, or they go back to the continual ongoing scandal we have with the LA Sheriff's Department of them having, actual gangs of deputies in certain stations that kind of function in a kind of complicated to explain, but generally problematic way. The issues in LA, that's a longer history that I think is more tied to people that were already here than it has to do with flight or relocation.
Okay. Defending turf in that case. I'm going to start to move to the technology piece of the discussion, but race first. Well, race and technology. Guns. Dave Chappelle has a great segment in his act where he says, he could get rid of the gun problem in America tomorrow. Just tell every Black person in the United States to register and get a firearm. He said you'd get legislation the next day, maybe even repealing the Second Amendment. Our guns, because we definitely don't see this in other countries. How much of this is guns as well?
How much of this being just general street violence, or the relationship between law enforcement and community?
The relationship between law enforcement, use of force as, a response to a fear of the other being armed, that kind of thing.
We don't see, I have to go back and look at the data. I mean, most of the shootings that in LA, that probably like most of the country, that generate the most controversy, the most community backlash, are usually, yes, when an unarmed person is shot by a law enforcement officer. And those situations tragically usually do produce from, they can produce from a situation where an officer, thinks somebody is armed but isn't. Does that come from a presumption on the part of the officer that I'm in a certain neighborhood, I'm dealing with a male between the ages of 18 and 27, and they don't look like me, thus they might be armed? I can't imagine that thought process has not played out in some of those cases. I am also not psychic, so I can't say it with certainty. But yeah, the cases in which, I can think of one that has always stuck with me, for instance, was a case down in Long Beach I covered. Two Long Beach police officers respond to a trespassing call. This is kind of the classic situation you see play out in the U.S., right? Very minor situation erupts into a death somehow.
Yeah.
So they respond to a trespassing call. There are supposedly some people squatting in an apartment that's either abandoned or just not being rented at the time. I don't remember exactly, but they shouldn't have been. They weren't supposed to be there. So they door knock, nobody answers. Whoever called them goes to get the building manager. Instead of waiting, one of these officers goes down a side alley and tries to peek through the window to get a better look. And while he's moving, he takes his gun out in the low ready position. I will let whoever's listening with tactical expertise debate whether or not that should have happened. But he leans through the window. He leads through the window with his firearm, sees a 19-year-old Hispanic male with his back turned, also sees his hands are not somewhere he can see them. The presumption is that the man is armed. He fires one shot, round goes through the back, and a young 19-year-old man named Hector Morejon's life is over for the crime of trespassing. And then if you want to talk about what escalates not trust, because of, I'm not going to do a full legal analysis here, in part because I probably wouldn't be capable of it, but generally speaking, as I'm sure you all know, laws, both state and federal, on police use of force generally give wide latitude to police officers. So the DA's office did not charge this officer. They excoriated his tactics. They made clear that they believed he escalated the situation, that he was one of the primary, if not the primary reasons that that Hector was killed, but they could not find legal grounds to charge him.
Wow. Yeah.
But all of that, is that all of that stemming probably from the presumption of the possession of the firearm? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again,
that wasn't there.
Exactly.
The gun wasn't there.
And so it magnifies itself, beyond all proportion. Just talking about technology, obviously the intelligent community forum talks about it a lot as a means of connecting people and doing some other things in the smart city area. But I want to ask you, when it comes to policing, what have you seen over the past, say, 5 years or so in covering your beat that both encourages you and terrifies or concerns you regarding the use of technology as it enters into policing? Body cameras, drones, etc.
I mean, some technology I think is a positive. I mean, body cameras, body worn cameras have been, generally speaking, especially in cities that make that footage public in the wake of a use of force incident or a critical incident or an in custody death. I think it's a very good thing because it kind of ends the speculation and the reliance on the cell phone video from across the street or the neighborhood chatter. It can kind of put something, not entirely, but something of an objective eye on these encounters that otherwise, when there's either incomplete information or misinformation out there, can lead to, clashes and other only further stoke mistrust. So body cameras are kind of, I think, inarguably a good thing, but I'm open to arguments on the contrary. So that's certainly a positive. There's other arenas that you mentioned where mission creep can get very scary. Facial recognition technology costs me sleep on a regular basis, and I don't even report on it that much. So my colleagues that do, I hope they have a lot of tea laying around or something else that's stronger to put them to bed at night. Drones have concerned me, although they have not been, their use has not been approved in as many cities as I would think. They were blocked from use in LA. Ring cameras, being funneling, and Amazon kind of sending that information back. You've got a license plate reader company like Vigilant in California that has partnered with ICE. It's just very easy for information to get zipped out from the agency that might need it to a repository that anyone can pull from at any moment, and all of that worries me. But like I said, there are definitely some police technological advances that I think are, like you said, body worn cameras for sure are a positive. I think departments have also just gotten a little better. I know this might sound basic, but just using social media and getting information out quickly, sometimes that can be good. You'll start to see more community seminars maybe held over a WebEx type of platform, and that will just allow more people to listen in that might not otherwise feel comfortable going to a police station. So there are some arenas in which I think police are being smarter about the use of technology and could potentially, get a slight boost to community trust if they use them properly. But that's counteracted, obviously, like you said, by the myriad ways this can go horribly wrong and fulfill all of our worst sci-fi nightmares.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the invasion of privacy is an enormous issue. There is a platform we did a did a segment with Dublin, Ohio, and a technology called Zen City platform where you can actually measure public sentiment in a community at any given time. So you can take the pulse and see, if things are heating up or cooling down. So stuff like that seems to be promising as long as, again, we're not invading people. It's some real primary levels. Um, but that was another discussion we had. Hey, James, so I'm gonna take you out of the newsroom. We're gonna elect you mayor of a leading city of say 450,000 people in the U.S. today, and the city started to pull itself back from a long decline from the industrial age. What would be your first policy for your police force? What would be the first thing you would look at and say to them based on all the great work you've done?
I
Mayor
get a,
Queally.
yeah, can I get a little more context for this SimCity experiment? Are we experiencing an increase or decrease in violent crime? Are my officer staffing levels reasonable, or am I coming off of, say, cutbacks?
Yeah, well, let's say that as with a lot of these communities, you've seen a drug problem, you've seen, a rise in crime from some of the social pathologies, the economic decline, but all of a sudden you're seeing these pockets of wins, and people are starting to come back, investments starting to come in. The police force, some of the quality of it may have gotten chased to the suburbs or other places. So you're kind of looking at it um, from scratch with those conditions.
So in that context, if my police department quality is significantly down or noticeably down, I might, provided the budget makes sense, I might increase whatever the entry level salary is. I've historically seen this kind of problem play out in. I don't think it's unfair to say urban police. I'm assuming, as you said, 450,000. I'm in a city at least the size of Long Beach, right? I'm in an urban center. I'm
Right.
not. Yeah. So that's larger than Newark. But I've saw this problem play out in Newark. I've seen this problem play out other places. Starting salaries for urban police departments tend to be way lower than suburban communities and bedroom communities, and urban policing is dramatically more challenging than
Oh yeah.
a gated community, borderline security guard job. So I do think there has historically been a problem with attracting good candidates, and I'm not disparaging. Like I said, my father was NYPD, so I'm not disparaging the by and large, but it's not unheard of to get less than ideal candidates for jobs that don't pay as well. I think that's basic economics. So I might bring up my entry level salary. Probably also want to, I've tended to see some positive outcomes from these diversionary programs, these law enforcement assisted diversion programs, where if you pick up somebody for a low level nonviolent offense, there's clearly an addiction problem, clearly a mental health problem. You try to steer them. I might make a department policy maybe to at least it'd have to be more complicated. I'm probably oversimplifying what it would actually have to be, but some kind of situation where there's a first time diversion, or what in Jersey they call this pretrial diversion. You steer them towards, if they say they have an addiction problem, you try to steer them towards a rehab program. If they're homeless, you try to steer them towards a shelter, as opposed to presenting a case to your local city prosecutor or DA, because that you're only going to recreate the problem then, right? Ultimately, if provided this person hasn't done anything violent, they don't have a record, I'm not saying there aren't situations where maybe you do come across somebody for a minor drug possession crime and you find out actually there's something more complicated going on. But in those situations where the incident is the only incident, and it's clearly been driven by an addiction or mental health issue, by charging that person, you are only putting a future barricade on housing, employment, any of the other societal obstacles that keep people trapped on that rung. So yeah, I might, if it did not already exist in fictional Queally town, population 450K. I need a better name for this city that I'm now mayor of.
I like Queally Town. Is that one word or two?
Let's go with two. Yeah, because you want. I think if that didn't already exist, I would want something like that in place.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you're saying at the very top of the show, which is it's that individual life, right? Which has so many repercussions in the community, And so if that potential isn't unlocked or moved forward, multiple people suffer. And I'm not so sure we always get that. We tend to think of it as sort of, we have to deal with large numbers when we talk about policy. But ultimately, we've seen it time and time again that when you have a couple of small victories in a community, things begin to turn around. And just along the Queally town policy you just described. So we'll see. I think it's good input. Last question. You've got another book coming out. You've got another novel coming out in the fall. All These Ashes. Can I ask you what the book is about?
Sure. So my first novel came out last year. It unsurprisingly follows an ex-reporter character who is in no way similar to me whatsoever.
No.
It's the first book deals a lot with issues of use of force, deals a lot with issues of, police community trust. I won't go too deep into it, spoiling anything, but the long and short of it is Russell Avery is the main character. He's an ex-reporter turned PI who has mostly been functioning as a fixer for police that are in trouble. He's honestly doing dirty work to kind of keep them out of IA jam-ups. He'll, bribe complaining witnesses to whatever. He's not exactly on the side of the angels here, or at least the side of better anything we've been talking about. He gets involved in a use of force case that he, in his opinion, is clearly he believes the officer has done wrong, and he starts investigating the surrounding circumstances of that and uncovers a larger issue inside of the Newark Police Department. So this kind of, breaks him out of that mode where he's helping the cops. The second one has to do a lot more with wrongful convictions in cold cases, which is something I've been writing about more in the past 2 years since I moved over to the courts beat. He more or less gets asked by a police officer who he's clashed with before to help write an investigation he believes he screwed up years earlier. There had been this is loosely based off of a real Newark case that I covered that has still messed me up to this day. But basically there's a horrible cold case killing where 4 teenagers disappeared and were presumed to have been burned to death. This officer contacts Russell pretty much having figured out way later that he arrested the wrong man and now wants to clear this guy's name, and the kind of plot goes from there.
Wow. This happened in Newark? The incident you're talking about?
It's a modified version of what there's a case called the Clinton Five in Newark. Five male teenagers went missing in, I believe, this late 60s or early 70s. I'd have to check. They were never found. There was no crime scene, no anything. And then 30 to 35 years later, the Newark PD, based solely on an informant who happened to be the guy's cousin's testimony, arrests somebody else, and they had no physical evidence, they had no witnesses, they had no anything. They put this guy to trial on 5 homicides though, based on his pretty much his co-conspirators' alleged confession that they had nailed these 5 kids inside of a closet in an abandoned building in Newark and burned it down around them because of a stolen pound of marijuana. The jury acquitted the man. The man has long held, I interviewed him 6-7 years ago. The man has long held that he was solely arrested for political purposes. Cory Booker was running for re-election as mayor of Newark at the time. He was also massively favored to win, so I don't think the conspiracy theory angle holds up, but it was more so I just wanted to highlight this case always stuck out to me, and it's kind of a repeat thing I always find when I write about wrongful convictions, especially from the 80s and 90s. Pre-DNA evidence, you had a lot of cases that were built almost solely or 80% on informant testimony that was often unreliable and picked up based in trade for release, or you'd have witness misidentifications, you'd have witness recanting, and really until the past 5 or 6 years, you haven't seen a lot of DA's office put up what are called conviction integrity units to re-examine these cases, and even when they do, they have very narrow parameters, and they did. So there are a lot of cases like that. The real life version of this, the man wasn't convicted of the crime.
Right.
In mine, this guy has been rotting away for 15 years in jail, allegedly for killing, teenagers that he, at least at the start of the story, you're led to believe he had nothing to do with.
You're right.
But before I wander into spoiler territory, I'm gonna shut up.
Yeah. No, let's read it. Sounds like a great book. And of course, another example of technology, right? The DNA interventions have done some things. Well, and that's coming out in September, you said?
I believe it's coming out September 28th. That's, that can always move around, but it should be late September.
Okay. All these ashes, and they can go to your website, jamesquealywriter.com, find out more.
Yes, sir.
Okay. How many hours a day do you write, by
Too many.
the
Um,
way?
I've been trying to take a little bit of a breather. I wrote most of that book during the pandemic, so sanity eluded me for a little bit.
Mm,
I'm just slowly kind of getting back into writing right now. I took a breather, working on a short story. But when I was on deadline for that, I was, pretty much doing newspaper stuff 8 to 9 hours a day. Took a break, usually to either cook dinner or work out or maybe relax, but I don't really know how to do that. And then probably another 1, 2, like, especially when I was getting close to deadline, probably another 1, 2 hours at night.
right.
So
Good night.
sometime between 10 and 11 hours most days.
Wow. That's tough writing at night, isn't it? You're not as fresh.
No, no, yeah. It'd be better if I got up before work and made a pot of coffee and tried to do a little fiction before moving into the journalism side of things. But I am notoriously not a morning person,
Yeah,
so I don't really work.
I hear you. Busy guy, though. Well, listen, James, I really appreciate you making the time to come by
This is
and
great.
talk.
Thanks for having me
Yeah,
on.
and good luck with everything. I'd like to thank James Queally for being with us today. For more information about him, visit James Queally, that's Queally, jamesquealywriter.com. And as I mentioned, in September, his second novel in his mystery series, All These Ashes, will be available, and we'll be talking about it or posting information about it on the ICF site as well. Many thanks to ICF Canada and ICF Taiwan for their support of this conversation. You can learn more about them and us at intelligentcommunity.org. This series is produced as a service to our network of intelligent communities and movement followers around the world. Shout out to our series producer, Matt Owen, and shout out to our new Smart 21 cities that were named in February at our Smart 21 conference in British Columbia. For more information on them and to learn about them, go to intelligentcommunity.org/smart21. And follow us on Twitter at New Communities and on Facebook. For the intelligent community, I'm Lou Zaccarella, reminding you that there really is no place like home. Take care, everybody.